Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. I know the lunch broke up a little bit late and we'll probably be joined by additional colleagues over the course of the session, but we've got a great discussion ahead. I'd like to go ahead and get started. I'm Geraldine Ritter, Senior Vice President of Global Public Policy and Corporate Responsibility, Corporate Secretary at Merck, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to moderate this panel today. In this session, as you know, we're going to tackle a really complicated but critically important topic around international trade and specifically focus on some of the challenges and the opportunities that the pending trade agreements that the U.S. administration is negotiating present for the biopharmaceutical industry. The two most recent negotiations, of course, being pursued by the Obama administration are the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which involves 12 Pacific Rim countries, as well as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership currently being negotiated with the European Union, and potentially the very complex issue underlying both negotiations, that of the Trade Promotion Authority legislation currently in Congress. So I hope we'll have time to touch on that topic today as well. I'm really delighted to be joined on the panel with a really incredible group of international trade experts here. And I'm excited to listen to their insights on all of these issues. At Pharma's request, I'm really going to keep introductions very short and dive right into the substance. So I know you all have in your briefing materials full bios on our panelists. If I may just briefly introduce, though, immediately on my left, Ambassador Hugo Pammens. He is currently Senior Advisor on the EU International Trade and Regulatory Affairs at Hogan Lovells. Prior to joining Hogan Lovells, however, he was Senior Diplomat representing the European Commission, having served as head of the European Commission's Washington delegation, as well as the EU's chief negotiator during the Uruguay round. On his left is Mr. Dan Price, Managing Director of Rock Creek Global Advisors, and Mr. Price served as a senior White House official in the administration of President George W. Bush, responsible for international trade, investment, development, and a host of many other things, as well as having served in senior roles as USTR as well during his career. And finally, at the end of the table, we're delighted to have with us Ambassador Arturo Sacaran. He is currently Chairman, Global Solutions, a Podesta company, and just until last year served with distinction as the Ambassador of Mexico to the United States, capping off a very long and distinguished career in the Mexican Foreign Service. Ambassador, thank you for joining us today. So I'd like to really dive right in and ask each of our panelists to set the scene for us a little bit around these trade agreements and give us your perspective with respect to TTIP and TPP. Why are these agreements so important, and where do we stand right now? Are we at a pivotal stage in these negotiations? Ambassador Pammens, could I start with you?
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here at this annual meeting of this very important trade association and to talk with you and be the same panel as my good friend Price, and honor to be with the ambassador. You ask us where we are with the trade negotiations, where is trade in general. I think I can say trade is not in good shape at this moment. And when I say this, it's not that trade itself is not good. Trade is happening, it's going relatively well. In any case, it's better than a couple of years ago. When I say trade, I mean perhaps more trade policy. Trade as it is discussed at the government, and I think that's what you are interested in. Trade is not in good shape because it has gone through a quite important development. Trade is now no longer what it was before. Trade policy has lost of its independence. It's now part of overall economic governance, where decisions are taken not so much in terms of what can I sell and what will I import. It's now part of the whole economic activity. And one good example is the relationship between trade and investment. There was a time when trade led to investment. Company did a good job, was selling in its home market, and of course after a while you expand and you go to enlarge your market. And if it really went well, you did some investment, distribution center, manufacturing after a while, and so on and so on. That's over. These days it's no longer trade that leads to investment, it's investment that leads to trade. And that's something which, as I said, reduces the autonomy of trade policy for our governments. A second element, of course, is the globalization. Globalization, which means that each and every phase of the production process, from the invention, the licensing, over to the agreements that have to be made with suppliers, distribution, and so on. At each of these stages of the production process, the international dimension is unavoidable. If it is not that one exports or imports, it's at least that other people import in your market, and you have to take it into account. So there is then also the real trade that definitely is shifting. It's shifting, I would say, eastwards. It's shifting to Asia, and of course to a large extent to, not exclusively, because in numbers it has its relativity, but clearly major trade flows are now also going to what we call the emerging countries, and certainly China is an important one. Then there is also the fact that trade policies, because of what I said, that the production process is now fragmented geographically and horizontally. It touches an enormous amount of governance areas which governments have to take into account, which means that there's much more, I would say, public opinion involved. There's much more control, much more public debate about what's good for the country in terms of agreements with this or that country, and how far people can go. So when I say all this is a complication for trade, and that is then at the last consideration I want to give is that we have somewhat lost control. We thought that by creating the WTO, the World Trade Organization, we would be able to grasp this new complexity of what trade had become, no longer trade of the GATT, but trade of the world trade system. And we thought we had that under control. Unfortunately, the transition from GATT to WTO is not a success at all. And it is not a success. We have seen it in the Doha round. And as a consequence, we have now, because that's the famous bicycle theory of trade, which we all know, when it doesn't work in the multilateral level, governments have to do something. And what do? They go for bilateral agreements. And that's at the origin of the other questions you asked. What about TTIP? What about TPP? Now, I'm not in a good position to talk about TPP because the Europeans are not involved, and I read about it in all kinds of papers and so on. I know a little bit more about TTIP, and I must say it was a formidable idea, certainly when it was launched. without going into details, because I don't want to be too long, I think we created a lot of expectations. I'm afraid we have until now not completely delivered on these expectations, created a kind of a political void, which of course gives the opportunity to the people who are not in agreement with you and who don't like the idea to come in the media and so on. So again, there is some kind of a problem. I hope it will have to do with contextual situations as well in Europe, where we have elections and new commissions and so on.
Yeah.
I also think that we have similar situations in the US. I hope that, I would say in the beginning of next year, it will be better.
Interesting. So Mr. Price, I'm curious, do you agree that trade is not in good shape, that we've lost control, and that we've got some unfulfilled expectations out there around these agreements under negotiation?
Let me start with the last point. The agreements aren't done, so necessarily we have unfulfilled expectations. In terms of what Ambassador Palmen described as the lack of autonomy or independence of trade from a variety of other topics, I personally think that's all to the good. And I think the supposed autonomy of trade from investment, from intellectual property, from services, from other things was always more fiction than fact. And that we see in agreements now a more integrated approach. To me, to respond to your question on first TPP and then TTIP, the key message of TPP is that comprising as it does developing middle income and advanced economies, it is a very strong signal to a few large emerging markets that they do not maintain a veto on trade and investment liberalization. If they want to stall it in the WTO, it will continue elsewhere. That said, I mean, the rhetoric around TPP being a, quote, 21st century agreement, it makes it incumbent on the parties to deliver. And I would point first to the United States. The United States can hardly ask other countries to make 21st century commitments if we will insist on 19th century protections. By which I mean all countries, including the United States, have domestically sensitive products. But what we do, that is what the United States does on footwear, apparel, textiles, dairy, these must sound familiar, Ambassador. They were there in the Uruguay round. What we do will set the level of ambition, and other countries will calibrate what they do on their sensitive issues, intellectual property, services, and investment, by how we act. TTIP. I think TTIP is actually a kind of unique opportunity. You're dealing with two economies, Europe and the United States, that, if you could put it this way, share a competitive advantage in regulatory competence. If there's one thing Europe and the United States know how to do, it's how to regulate complex services and products. So we can take what might otherwise be seen as a burden and a series of impediments wrought by divergent regulation and bring this regulatory competence to bear in making our rules more convergent, figuring out areas where the outcomes of our regulatory system are equivalent such that we need not duplicate the regulatory review in both jurisdictions. Pharmaceutical plant inspections, GMP, I mean, it's an obvious candidate for that.
Yep.
I think TTIP provides a really wonderful opportunity for two advanced regulatory economies to try and work things out in a way that deals with the last, or not the last, but many of the remaining behind the border impediments to trade and investment flows.
Interesting. Ambassador Sarikhan, Ms. Price talked about the strategic importance of TPP to the United States. Does it have the same strategic importance to Mexico?
Absolutely. But let me, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm so glad to join Ambassador Baumann and my dear friend and colleague Dan Price, with whom we worked on a lot of these issues when he was in the Bush administration. Certainly for a country like Mexico, I think both the TPP and hopefully, Ambassador Baumann, TTIP will be the core of a new strategic alignment. And I say hopefully because, as most of you probably in the room know well, of the three North American countries, Mexico today is the only country that has a free trade agreement with the European Union. Canada is in the process of finalizing its free trade agreement. And so when the United States and the European Union set themselves the task of negotiating TTIP, I sort of started asking the question, which I think is a very basic question, which is, where are Canada and Mexico? Because what you're probably going to end up having is three similar, different sort of dated at different moments of free trade negotiations, the Mexican-European Union being the older one, that are relatively similar, but that are not harmonized. And just think, sort of, I'll throw in two sectors, or even three sectors, given the conference that we're in today, that have a very important footprint in the North American-European space: aerospace, automotive, and pharma. The investments, the footprint of European companies in the US, of US and European companies in Mexico, of increasingly Mexican companies in the United States and these integrated supply and production chains that have been one of the great success stories of NAFTA. The question that you have to ask is how having three parallel, similar, but uncoordinated free trade agreements at the end of the day is going to allow us to harmonize issues like rules of origin, for example. And so I think that as you look at the free trade negotiation template, whether it's TTIP or TPP, for a country like Mexico, this is really about geostrategic. This is a real geostrategic driver. You were asking sort of the question that we're sort of debating here, where are we on the free trade agreements? Are we succeeding? Are we failing? I would tend to concur with Dan on the point of we're still in the middle of the negotiation. Obviously, the fact that TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, seems to be in a bit of a mess here is having an impact on how Japan negotiates with the United States, and the news coming from these bilateral talks as part of the TPP don't seem to be very encouraging. So I don't think that we will. I don't think we're going to meet the mark of an April wrap-up on TPP. TTIP is further back in terms of the start of the negotiations. So yes, they're a work in progress. Yes, there will be challenges. There will be very important challenges. And sort of to riff on something that I heard you say, in many ways, I think the challenge is how do we move to a 21st century trading framework, which TPP and TTIP certainly are, taking into account 20th century protectionism and 20th century instincts for protectionism. And at the same time, how do we deal with the return to 19th century concepts of national sovereignty, whether it's because of ancillary stuff like NSA spying that have contaminated and impacted, for example, the TTIP negotiations, or whether it's countries in the TPP negotiations feeling that they do have to, or they can't afford to take on very powerful domestic constituencies in specific sectors, and therefore are not willing to develop this 21st century rules-based trading system on issues like IPR, for example. Yep. I would always joke as an ambassador. Jim O'Neill, who's as you know, most of you know, was the gentleman who coined the BRIC acronym. When I was Consul General in New York, sort of would approach me gingerly because he said, "I know you're going to be annoyed that there's an M missing in the BRIC acronym." And I said, "Look, not quite, because I think I'm a huge rock and roll fan, and I'm a Pink Floyd fan." And so I told him, "I think that Mexico is more than just a brick in the wall." What I was trying to get at is that on issues like IPR, which are so important for this industry, Mexico is really light years ahead in terms of how this doesn't mean that everything is peachy and rosy on issues of IPR in Mexico, but the fact that Mexico is one of the only, along with Morocco, the two emerging economies that sat down with the United States, with the European Union, with Canada, with New Zealand, with Australia, with South Korea, with Japan, to negotiate ACTA, and that Mexico moved ACTA forward, I think tells you a bit of how, for example, the four BRIC countries understand challenges and issues like IPR, and how Mexico, because of its very aggressive free trade agreement network that it's been building since NAFTA in 1993, has taken on these issues. And there is an important difference. I also think that we need to take into account that regionalization or sub-regionalization is probably becoming predominant in the way that countries come together to engage, look at the Pacific Alliance in the context of Latin America. Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia, now with Panama probably coming in, how that links up to TPP, because of those, Mexico and Chile are TPP negotiating partners. So when you think of the WTO template and how that has failed to deliver the goods, despite the concerns, the very valid concerns of how bilateralism and bilateral free trade agreements at the end of the day do weaken the attempts to build this multilateral universal system, it's not rocket science to figure out why most countries, including my country, have gone down this route of building sub-regional or regional groupings, which, tongue-in-cheek, if you allow me, Dan, are a coalition of the free trade willing. That's what the Pacific Alliance is, that's what TPP is, and that's what, at the end of the day, TTIP can become.
Interesting, and you, in a way, have given me a perfect segue into my next question, which was really around intellectual property rights. As this panel and this audience knows well, intellectual property protection is traditionally this industry's #1 concern in most of the trade agreements under negotiation because of the nature of our industry. We depend on innovation, and innovation ultimately depends on the protection of intellectual property. But we have often, I think, not communicated this very well, and I think we've struggled for how to do that better, to convey not only that we strongly believe that stronger intellectual property protection is in the interest of the industry and the interests of patients and the interests of meeting unmet medical needs around the world, but also that stronger intellectual property protection is in countries' interests in developing innovative life sciences sectors. I'm often struck by how often our senior leaders, the senior leaders I know of many other multinational companies, are approached by trade and development officials from countries around the world asking for advice on how to attract investment, how to launch a life sciences cluster or grow the domestic life sciences industry. And the role of intellectual property rights in that growth is still insufficiently appreciated. Given Mexico's track record, what advice would you have for the industry as to how to better communicate the value of strong intellectual property protection?
Well, to be very blunt, I wish that by saying Mexico's track record, it were purely positive and peachy. There are areas where there's certainly been important successes. Yeah. There are areas where we're still facing significant challenges. I think that one of the things that as a recovering diplomat, I still use the we sometimes, so pardon me. But I think one of the things that Mexico was able to do in the last years was to really carefully look at its regulatory bodies, revamp them, and modernize them, because we were dealing with, for example, the pharma industries in Mexico, and we had a completely outdated, untransparent, unaccountable regulatory body that was deciding which medicines got approved, which ones didn't, what the protocols looked like. So I think Mexico has been building the institutional blocks that should allow it to have a stellar track record as an emerging industrializing nation, and sort of set an example as to how you can both protect IPR, ensure the business footprint of those companies, investors, researchers, universities that are co-stakeholders to the industry, but at the same time serve a social and human well-being objective. As you look at TTIP and TPP, per your question, I think that again we're faced with a conundrum that has been with us for quite some time, and that the national governments, the state, the nation state, negotiators, and even sometimes the private sector involved have not done a good job, which is to ensure that society, civil society and NGOs are co-stakeholders in the process. And I don't mean to suggest that there's no consultation process occurring with NGOs, whether it's in TTIP or TPP. But certainly if you look at every time I put up a tweet saying this or that about TPP or TTIP, I get a flurry of responses questioning either the opacity of the negotiating process, it's happening behind closed doors, there isn't sufficient social consultation, or with a lack of knowledge which equates, for example, TPP to, oh, you're trying to prevent internet freedom. And so I think the national governments, negotiating teams, and the private sector need to do a better job in explaining to our publics what this is about, what this isn't about, find more effective means, and this is a discussion that I had a lot with my former New Zealand colleague, who, as you know well, is Ambassador Mike Moore, because of his role at the WTO, is very well versed in this issue. And this is a concern that both he and I shared. Two very different countries, New Zealand and Mexico, with two different economic and trade footprints, with a very different trade relationship with the United States, but with the same concern as to how do we avoid the pitfalls of sending the signals that this is business as usual, in the sense that the negotiations are happening behind closed doors, that there's a lack of transparency. There are obviously things that you can't negotiate in public. We all know that. Everyone who has had to negotiate anything, whether it's Mexican avocados or trucks or a large regional or sub-regional free trade agreement, knows that you can't sort of do an open door negotiating process. Right. But we have to find a balance and an equilibrium, because if not, sectors like pharma, sectors like sort of technology, internet, these will come back to bite you, as we saw in the US a couple of years ago with SOPA. Nothing to do with pharma, it had to do with, internet and freedom of navigation and internet and access to the internet. But I think the type of responses that we saw from public opinion using these new tools, which are a very effective way of blocking, of creating noise in the system, which are social media platforms, we have to be much more nimble in understanding how we take advantage of those resources, but also how we create a sense of social co-stakeholdership in the deals that we're putting on the table.
Interesting. And that theme of social co-stakeholdership, I think, is particularly important in this area. Mr. Price, the issue of intellectual property and access to medicines has been a particularly complicated one for at least 15 years. And certainly we feel very strongly that intellectual property, particularly over the long term, absolutely ensures access to medicines, but we recognize the concerns of many stakeholders out there that it can pose a barrier to access to medicines. You've followed these issues for a long time. What trends do you see, and where do you think this debate is headed? And in particular, I'm interested in your perspective on whether it is possible to evolve this debate past maybe some of the stale back and forth that has characterized some past negotiations and into a more nuanced and constructive dialogue around healthcare reform and the real determinants of access to medicines.
I do.
Good.
As you well know, and as many of the people in this room well know, the industry has had some missteps along the way.
Absolutely.
And what we may describe as the essential legal protections to foster a culture of innovation and continue bringing life-saving drugs to market, other people regard as a monopolist license to exploit and extract the last penny, catering to the rich and robbing the poor of access to these same drugs. So I think there's a couple of things that one has to do. First, one has to equate and relate intellectual property to a culture of innovation and talk about intellectual property together with research collaboration among government, universities, and the private sector. Effective capital markets to support entrepreneurial and innovative activity, effective regulatory approval processes, and market access in terms of sensible and transparent reimbursement processes. And it's got to be a package so that when you have the discussion with the Minister for Economic Development, it's not rapacious monopolist profits being raked out of the country. Rather, you're talking about intellectual property rights as one of the key elements in a basket of policies for them to foster a culture of innovation. That's one piece of it. The second piece of it is, and a number of companies are going down this path already, is you can't simultaneously ask for folks to respect intellectual property and not be tempted down the path of either redefining patentability rules or generously interpreting compulsory license abilities. You want them to resist that? You have to go down the path of tiered pricing. You just do. And right? And you can do it in a sophisticated way. It needn't simply be country by country. It needn't simply be, income level for this particular time. But within countries, particularly large countries, there are different markets and different ability to pay. So a more nuanced approach to pricing, a more holistic explanation of the benefits of intellectual property and its link to economic development, I think can perhaps begin to change the discussion.
Interesting. Thank you. Ambassador Palman, these issues have also been controversial in some of the EU's negotiations, for example, with India. Do you see potential scope for the U.S. and the EU to work together to advance this dialogue?
I think so, and I hope so in any case. And I couldn't say it better than Dan has done on the general level. It's always good to know where you come from. The first time that intellectual property was discussed on a general level was in the Uruguay round. And out of that came the TRIPS agreement. Now, the TRIPS agreement had advantages and had disadvantages. The disadvantages were that it was a formulation of minimum standards of protection for each of the different branches of intellectual property, but with, in general, formulated in a way which allowed different implementation and different interpretation. The good thing about it was that it gave a kind of enforcement framework which potentially can work when the conditions are right. And of course, the second advantage of the TRIPS agreement was that it was part of the WTO dispute settlement. But again, that only works when you have a framework of well understood commitments and so on. So the reaction, of course, was that for the developed countries, that was not enough, and they would have gone farther. For the developing countries, it was much too much. And came out of that process the famous declaration of 2001, a Doha Declaration, which in fact let things go loose and more or less allowed developing countries to make the interpretation which more or less they wanted to. And as a reaction to that, because that was not the basis to solve the real problems of the world, came the bilateral agreements, which as well the United States as the Europeans and other countries had, where gradually they tried to strengthen, re-strengthen, or no, to strengthen the disciplines which they had not obtained in the TRIPS agreement, and which had even gone beyond what was acceptable in the so-called Doha Declaration. Now, this has come to a point, I think, where certainly the United States has a certain number of successful, one can say in the given circumstances, bilateral agreements where you have a intellectual property chapter, as well as the Europeans have with a certain number of countries. But there's a limit, and it cannot be the final solution. So what clearly is necessary, and I think that's the direction in which Dan has spoken also, is a kind of holistic approach. In other words, you have, as an industry, the enormous challenge to reconcile two things which seem to be, I wouldn't say contradictory, but difficult to reconcile, and but which, at the end of the day, cannot live without themselves. You cannot have a good, strong intellectual property protection system without having people who at the end of the day will be the people for whom you are working. Because if you make it too difficult, at the end you will end up not having clients in absurdum. So you have to find a reconciliation with what we absolutely need, and you are right, a strong intellectual protection system, but you have to keep in mind that there are people at the end of the process. At the same time, access to medicine is good, as long as they are good medicines. And the clients for the medicines change. The burden, the so-called burden of medicine, changes with the population. Aging population, with people have different illnesses and so on. Again, you cannot have a realistic policy of access to medicine if you don't have a flexible, innovative, intellectual property protection system. Don't ask me the solution, how you have to reconcile that. That's the big challenge. I know that a lot has been written about this already. A certain number of experiments have been made, for instance, with India. There are some, I can say in this room here, the negotiations with India don't go very well. I haven't said it, so that's not where, at least for the moment, the solution is. But clearly it's a country where one should be able to explore what's reasonable. What's the reasonable balance between the good protection system and, on the other hand, keeping in mind access to medicine is the ultimate goal of the whole exercise.
Thank you. You know, I'm interested in maybe taking those comments and putting them more specifically in the context of the TPP, either Ambassador Sakharov or Mr. Price. In thinking about how TPP could really shape global standards of intellectual property rights, given the very different levels and the very different nature of the countries involved in that negotiation, is an agreement that maybe only marginally strengthens the intellectual property, the level of intellectual property rights protection worthwhile, or should the U.S. Really try to push hard for a very high standards agreement that seeks the same level of protection as, for example, is found in U.S. law? Do you have a thought on that, either of you? And certainly during all of this dialogue, do feel free to jump in.
It's a negotiation. The U.S. is not going to get everything it wants. Do I think that there will be progress in TPP on the IPR chapter? Absolutely. Yeah. But again, you have to measure the progress on IPR not just by looking at the IPR chapter, right? And not just saying how many years of data exclusivity or any other particular kind of numerical metrics. You've got to look at the transparency chapter. You've got to look at the dispute settlement provisions. You've got to look at the intergovernmental dispute settlement provisions, and you've got to look at the viability of the investor-state dispute settlement provisions, right? Because what you get in terms of intellectual property protection is going to be rooted in the administrative and judicial system of the country where your investment or sales take place, where you want to enforce those intellectual property rights. And you can have a great chapter that makes all kinds of promises, but if the administrative and regulatory infrastructure for implementation and enforcement is not there, not worth much.
That is very
so
true.
I would look at a number of chapters in addition to the IPR chapter. But just to answer your question, is it worth doing even if the changes are only incremental? Absolutely. Look at the composition of the parties in that room.
I fully concur with Dan. I think sort of is it worth pushing to achieve new standards even if we don't get the full Monty? Or the whole enchilada, depending on which term you want to use. Absolutely. Because number one, it creates traction, it creates movement. Second, because there will have to be at one point, obviously, an evaluation of whether the perfect becomes the enemy of the good and whether we can get a good deal. Maybe it wasn't everything that we all wanted, but it moves the needle far enough in developing this new template for a rules-based 21st century international trading system. Look, sort of, I would put it this way. In many ways, and I bring NAFTA up, again, not because that's what I did for 6 years, but because NAFTA was the first free trade agreement of its kind involving a fully industrialized economy like the US and an industrializing nation like Mexico. In many ways, sort of the mix that we have today in the TPP negotiating parties. You've got the Canadas and the New Zealands and the Australias and the Japans of the world, but you've also got the Mexico, the Chiles, the Bruneis, the Vietnams of the world. So that's why I sort of bring you back to NAFTA. NAFTA in many ways was the sort of the 1.0 of free trade agreements. It was the first attempt to bring two countries as asymmetric as Mexico and the United States were back in 1993. And it became the gold standard of all free trade agreements. All bilateral free trade agreements that followed NAFTA were what I would call 2.0 free trade agreements. TPP is a 3.0 free trade agreement. It's really trying to set the new standard for everything from IPR to environmental issues, to labor, to state-owned enterprises. So if we can move, first of all, the needle forward on IPR, But if in toto, maybe some chapters will be more advanced and more sophisticated than others, but if in that single undertaking of a negotiation we have a good deal, I think we would be really dumb in A, not going for the deal, and not banging the drum on the importance of having achieved these milestones. I also concur with Dan that the challenge, once again, in the negotiations, because it's a similar challenge to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, as to, you know, how do you take on, push back, and take account of social, NGO pushback on some of these issues. And in many ways, I think the negotiations will be a microcosmos of this. IPR can't be seen as one single issue. It's linked to a number, to the rule of law, to accountability, to whether the regulatory bodies have teeth, to how are you fostering national, domestic business footprints that can build into, feed off, enrich the template of research, of testing, of application, practical application to public health issues. If you can piece it into this larger fabric, then I think you've got a much larger chance, despite the standards maybe not being as aggressive or as ambitious as originally planned for, still being good enough to deliver. Exactly.
Yeah, certainly.
If you allow me, the relationship of the intellectual property protection discussions with TTIP, or TTIP, as the Americans say, I think if I was the pharmaceutical industry of the United States, I would not too much link my fate to the success of TTIP. I'm very much in favor of a successful TTIP, let that be very, very clear. And I totally agree with Dan that the regulatory environment is very important and is, up to a certain point, a condition for whatever else to work. But you know, you have a very good tradition to work directly with your colleagues in Europe. I was there when the negotiations on the tariffs in the Uruguay round were done. We let you negotiate. And at the end of the Uruguay round, we said very much, thank you, industry, pharmaceutical industry. You have done our job, and we will integrate what you have done in the results of the negotiations. And there was the 0 for 0 for pharmaceutical products. It's true, it hadn't worked for all the developing countries, etc. But the work was done by the industry. I think this is an issue which the industry should discuss. And I know you do it, by the way. You do a lot. And that's, I imagine, one of the reasons there is no common position given to the negotiators on intellectual property by the pharmaceutical industry as such. And for good reasons. The common paper on regulatory convergence of the industry, pharmaceutical industry, I think is very good. It's very good because it makes a difference. It makes a difference to what can be done bilaterally. It make what can be done with other, I would say, developed countries, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, and Mexico, probably, I don't know. And then they have a third category where they say, well, it depends where we can do it in the best way. Now, this concept has something to do with the concept of TTIP itself. I admit that. And I must say I was not very happy when at a certain moment it was presented as this negotiation, which is as wide as has been said by others, that could be done with one tank of gas. That's simply not the case. It's too complicated, and it would be too easy, and you will not solve the problem. You will come to a compromise, because all these negotiations at a certain moment have to be rounded up, and then you have great results. If you really want to do the job, do it yourself. Discuss with your European colleagues and bring in whoever is necessary. But in TTIP, it happens that the United States and Europe have already a system which is pretty much developed and goes much further than any other area in the world. build on that in a very pragmatic way and do it according to the merits of the case, the difficulties of the issues. And this is, by the way, an advice I give to other industrial sectors. I think the time of the single undertaking of these big rounds is over. We needed rounds because we had no institution. There was no WTO. Now that we have the institution, each of the issues should be dealt with on their own merits. And I think IPR is typical for the pharmaceutical industry. Of course, there is IPR in other sectors, but as it is presented, it's pretty typical for the pharmaceutical industry. I would say discuss it between those you are most involved with, and then give it to the negotiators and tell them, this is what we think is the best solution to our problem. I would think that they will be very happy that you have done the work for them.
Sorry.
Sure, please.
And I also want to jump in.
By all means.
I would say the upside for the pharmaceutical industry in the transatlantic, in the TTIP negotiations, isn't in the IPR chapter.
Yeah.
It's in the kind of regulatory coordination, mutual recognition, right? I mean, you all know better than I do. Think of the cost of bringing a drug to market. Now, take the regulatory portion of that cost, clinical trials, everything, cut it in half. Does it make tiered pricing look different? So, and it's not simply a matter of the US and Europe getting it right and squeezing out redundancies. I was on a panel with the head of the Turkish FDA and the head of the Brazilian FDA, and I was sitting where you were. And so I said, you know, have you considered mutual recognition of FDA determinations? And they said, when you consider mutual recognition of EMA determinations, we'll consider mutual So a lot of the world is looking at the two most developed, two most sophisticated regulatory systems and saying, you don't trust each other?
Yeah.
Right? When a plant is inspected in Germany for the production of pharmaceuticals for European consumers, it's deemed safe. It's not safe enough for the Americans, and vice versa. Why should it be safe enough for the Brazilians?
It's true. It's true. I think the industry absolutely does feel strongly that that is the single biggest gain, potentially, out of TTIP. Question is, can we get there?
Right.
It's almost sort of an issue. It's also almost a question of the egg and the chicken, because what I wanted to jump in with was that whereas I don't think that the IPR issues in general and even in the pharma sector are particularly contentious in the TTIP negotiations,
right,
they are for the TPP. So we shouldn't put TTIP and TPP in the same basket when it comes to IPR, and in particular IPR over pharmaceuticals, because the political context, the diplomatic context, and the social context and the way that NGOs operate in those two environments are very different. So we should be careful not to sort of try and fit them into the same pair of jeans. Having said that, I think Dan is absolutely right. If TPP negotiating countries or others that are outside the current sphere of negotiations, whether it's the TTIP or the TPP, see that the two most sophisticated regulatory trading countries, the European Union nations and the United States, can't move the ball forward, sort of where are the incentives for Japan to find a compromise with the US and unclog the negotiations of the TPP? Where do you solve some of the pressing issues that still persist in IPR in the TPP negotiations? And where do you convince the outliers, the Indias, the Brazils, the Chinas of the world, that this 21st century rules-based template that we're developing, whether in the context of TTIP or whether in the context of TPP, that they need to become co-stakeholders and if not join, then adapt the same practices, standards, etc., as are being negotiated in these two very ambitious free trade agreement processes. So that's an important issue. And then the other one, I fully agree, Ambassador, that sort of conceptually we are at a stage today where the single undertaking model should not be preventing us from moving forward à la carte on those issues where we have achieved consensus, where the industries play a very important role in supporting the negotiating role of the governments. But at the same time, remember that we're enmeshed in the United States, in Washington, in a very divisive and acrimonious debate over TPA. And it's very unclear how TPA there are two questions. Is this administration going to get TPA anytime soon? And if they do, is that your mom and pop TPA? Is it the TPA that we dealt with when we negotiated NAFTA, or that the Bush administration obtained to negotiate the free trade agreements with Peru or with Colombia? Or is it going to be a different sort of TPA? And this isn't this is a very relevant question, because at the end of the day, this is why I think it's relevant to your very valid point of how the single undertaking negotiation model works and doesn't. If a Japan in TPP or a Mexico on some of the IPR issues, or think that whatever bargain they have reached in a specific area of the negotiations that has now been closed is going to get nitpicked by Congress, and that it will unravel and therefore the deal will not stand, you've got a bit in many ways, single undertaking helped bulletproof the deals, not in the negotiation per se, but once they reached Capitol Hill here. And I think that a lot of the countries looking at TPA, including Japan, are wondering whether, once the administration does get any form of thumbs up from Congress, what that thumbs up is going to look like. Is it going to be the traditional TPA authority, or is it going to be a different one, which then may force you to rethink the template of single undertaking negotiations, because that may be the only way to navigate the deals that you've achieved with your partners through.
You know, it's exactly where I was going to go next. Whenever we talk about TPP and TTIP, I feel like there's an elephant in the room, and that elephant is the U.S. Congress, and whether these deals ultimately can get done. I'm interested in discussing a bit further, given the state of and the dim prospects at present for TPA legislation to get passed, how much further can we go in TPP and TTIP negotiation? Can we make much more progress without some assurance of congressional support?
Can I say something as a non-American, so it's totally out of any importance, but still. My feeling is that, as the ambassador said, that TPA was very useful. The system was very useful in the past, but that refers to a situation where it was easy to make compromises within the package, which then was brought to the Congress. And in fact, initially, I think refers to the time there were tariff negotiations. And the great advantage of tariffs was that they were fungible. They were fungible. You could negotiate, as we have learned in the textbooks, tariffs on textiles against tariffs on cars. And I imagine that this was what the compromise that was made between the different stakeholders in the package, and that was it's become very difficult to negotiate intellectual property, to make a package, and then to make compromises, because packages, as Dan said, there are always compromises. But making a compromise on intellectual property becomes difficult. We have seen it. The developed countries thought they had made a compromise when they accepted the Doha Declaration in 2001. In fact, they gave away the store without knowing it. So it's difficult to make compromises at this moment when, as I said in the beginning, trade has become a much more complex operation than it was some time ago. Now, I'm not familiar with the situation. I have nothing to say. I'm totally incompetent. I would like to hear what my colleagues think of this.
Well, I think TPA, as a technical matter, do you need trade promotion authority? is a total red herring. The elephant in the room is whether or not this administration is prepared to spend political capital to secure the approval of comprehensive trade agreements. That's the elephant in the room. And so when our counterparties talk about, well, TPA, it's not about TPA, because in my experience as a trade negotiator, when the other guy says, well, you don't have TPA authority, you don't have fast track authority, that means he doesn't want to give me what I want. That's all that means. But what we have seen is that the so-called promise of TPA, that the agreement won't be picked apart, is a false promise anyway. We had TPA for Colombia, South Korea,
Very true.
Panama, and Peru.
It's very true.
Did that stop Congress and a new administration from reopening those agreements? No.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, they went back and renegotiated the auto provisions of Korea.
And the IP provisions.
Pardon me?
And the IP provisions.
The IP provisions, labor provisions with Colombia. So it's not the promise it once was.
Right.
As I said, the real question that our negotiators, that our counterparties have is, once we strike a deal, will you spend the political capital to get it done? And that's an open question. Sorry, in the minds of many of our counterparties.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. I've got a number of other questions, but I want to make sure we don't run out of time before I give the chance for everyone in the room to ask questions as well. Can I throw it open and ask if there are any questions from the floor for our panelists? Or any questions that you all have for each other? Feel free as well. Mr. Fraser.
Thank you all for joining us today. Mr. Price made a comment earlier on that in terms of our industry demonstrating its commitment to access in the context in which innovation can continue to come forward, one of the key elements is to demonstrate a willingness to engage in differential pricing, tiered pricing within a country. My question to you is, in your experience, have you found that there will be willing partners in terms of countries on the other side? Because often countries that are maybe middle tier income countries want to be given a pothole price. And when we try to interact with them on that basis, I think they understand the economic logic that their populations have very different purchasing power. But they prefer to be thought of as being characterized by the lowest common denominator when it comes to the prices that they pay.
I think you are absolutely right. That would be their preferred posture. But I think if you look at most countries' regulatory systems, they differentiate between rural and urban. They differentiate small and medium-sized enterprises from large enterprises, and have within their systems, whether it's differential subsidies that are available depending on where they live, income level. So these distinctions are made all the time. And it seems to me that you're in a pretty good position to say, look, we understand pricing and ability to pay are related, and we're prepared to walk down that road with you, but let's do it as you have done it yourself in other areas, and not take a monolithic approach that says the price for this drug for everybody in India is the same, when we well know that in different areas, in different population centers, and some of these population centers are the same size as Belgium, that there are differing abilities to pay. So I think it's well worth having that conversation and invoking as a precedent the way they administer their own public funds and their own social welfare programs.
Are there other questions? Jeff?
We were addressing a couple of different elephants in the room throughout the dialogue. I wanted to put another one on the table. When you look at the trade agreements that are being negotiated, there are three countries that are noticeably absent. We were addressing this a bit, Dan, part of this trade discussion and move it forward? Is there a way ultimately to make this a set of global standards that are being approached with the WTO being moribund right now? Or is it just something we can't be hoping for, at least in the near term?
Do you want to, I'll follow you and I'll take a stab at
Okay.
that too.
These are, I think, gateway agreements that we're negotiating, right? If we get the architecture of horizontal regulatory cooperation versus sectoral mutual recognition right in TTIP, this is a template that others can participate in. So I don't see them as exclusive. TPP is a slightly different story. The pace of economic integration in the Asia Pacific was proceeding without the United States, and I would say at a relatively low level of ambition, at least in terms of a U.S. approach. So it was essential when these negotiations were launched during the last administration that the U.S. have a foothold in Asian economic integration. After all, our market was the engine for their integration, since most of the products that constituted intra-Asian trade were ultimately destined for our market. So why don't we actually sit at the table? This is not, I don't think it was ever conceived of, nor do I think the present administration conceives of it as a bulwark against or as exclusive of China. This is a self-selecting group. My view is it is open to others, and if they want to dip a toe in by, say, starting with the plurilaterals in the WTO on the, environmental goods or trade and international services agreement, great. Let's see if those states are willing to put on the table commitments and concessions commensurate with the benefits that they derive from membership in the global economy. When the answer to that is yes, they will join TPP, they will replicate the architectures of TTIP, and hopefully unlock new multilateral negotiations.
I'll have a bit of a, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but probably more of a realist approach to the question, even though I'm as hopeful as Dan is that by example or by the danger of being excluded from these new paradigmatic models of trade, some of the countries that you've mentioned will eventually step into the fold. I think that we have to recognize that whereas some countries, and I think the European Union there is the most salient example, have understood that one of the fundamental components of the 21st century rules-based system is that you trade a bit of sovereignty for the common good. Some of the countries that you've mentioned are still completely inserted in a Westphalian national sovereignty state-to-state model. And so conceptually, I think, in terms of their global vision and their global or regional aspirations, it's going to be a very hard sell to convince them to come to the table and subscribe to a series of rules where they think they lose out, either because ideologically they're there or because there are real domestic concerns that they will lose out. So I think we have to inject a dose of realism into how much can and cannot be achieved in bringing some of these outliers of the processes that we've been talking about into this type of frameworks. Now, having said that, especially in the case of TPP, I think it is a mechanism that's not about who's not there, but it's about who wants to be there. There's no criteria in TPP of you can't participate. It's really an open process. And again, let me take you to the sub-regional level in Latin America, the Pacific Alliance, which is nowhere it's nowhere as ambitious as TTIP or TPP. But the dynamics that the Pacific Alliance between Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru has triggered in less than a year have brought Panama and Costa Rica to the table of their own volition. Nobody put a gun to their head and said, oh, you've got to come in or else this will happen. They realize that this framework that is being developed to facilitate trade, to harmonize regulations, to further bring down tariffs, to enhance business travel, that this made sense. And again, it's not a surprise not only that Panama and Costa Rica are now in line to become full-fledged Pacific Alliance members. You've got countries like Canada or Spain or other extra-hemispheric countries that are saying, we want to be observer nations to the Pacific Alliance process, because they're seeing a model that is about raising and defining new standards of economic and trade interaction, which are very compelling, given some of the challenges that we're seeing, either whether it's in the WTO or in sets or subsets of regional or multilateral negotiations. But I do think, again, per your question, we have to be realistic about how much, how soon, and how quick some of these countries will be either tempted or convinced, because of self-interest and self-preservation, to adhere to these new standards that are being negotiated both in TTIP and in TPP.
Are there other questions? Well, maybe while you all are thinking, I've got one, Ambassador Poman. You know, when we read about the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and the EU lately, TTIP is actually not the usual subject of the article. It's either tensions with Russia or frankly, a lack of trust coming out of NSA revelations. How much of a setback to the TTIP negotiations are these security concerns and maybe this erosion of trust? Is there room to also be advancing trade negotiations in this kind of environment?
Well, I have to say that, yes, there was clearly an issue that came up with the revelations about spying exercises that had been going on without us knowing, and even apparently a certain number of important people in the United States not knowing. Whether this is going to make TTIP impossible, no, that's not true. I think at the government level, people know that security is an important issue, that Europe depends on the United States to a large extent for its security, and that implies a certain number of things. We very much hope that what the President has announced in terms of reviewing the way in which things work here in the United States will clarify this. It's not, of course, on the table of TTIP for good reasons. If there was a good solution to the protection of private data on the commercial side, not on the security side, that would certainly be of great help. At the governmental level, as I said, I don't think this will make it impossible to have a normal negotiation. And by the way, the negotiations are going on very well. The problem of TTIP at this moment is not so much the negotiators and the technical work that's being done. I'm in contact from time to time. It's going rather well. The problem is the political level. And there is a kind of mutual, I think I can call it somewhat suspicion, that the other side is not ready yet, or is not ready because of the political context of the country. The Europeans will say, we don't know whether President Obama is really in favor of a trade agreement. Trade is not very important for him. And there are other issues, and he has not even his own party with him. And the Congress, well, in any case, not work. Let's work for TPA, wait for TPA, etc. And the Americans will say, yes, the Europeans have to first agree between themselves about the basic things, what's going to happen with the new commission, etc., etc. So for the moment, the negotiators, I think, are working very well. The political level is waiting, was observing. They make good speeches, but not very much has happened. One thing, now that we are in presence of the business community, the business community is also a little bit wait and see on this. And what I would like to do is to, whatever audience, whatever representative of the business community is, please, if you think it's a good idea to do TTIP, say it, and say it loudly, and perhaps do it yourself. Negotiators, they welcome input from the industry, and they welcome if the industry can do the job for themselves. So overall, I don't think, to answer your question, I don't think that the spying security issue is going to be an issue. The issue is managing the process. And I have always seen TTIP much more in terms of a process than in terms of a performance. That's why I didn't like the tank.
Geraldine, I do think that the surveillance spying controversy is linked to an issue that is going to have to be resolved in TTIP, and one that poses, I think, a particular threat to the pharmaceutical industry, and that is restrictions on cross-border data flows. How do you get clinical trial data from the geography where the trial was run back to the lab? How do you get data sets from one regulator to another? If the world begins to see a proliferation of measures as were threatened in Brazil,
Balkanization,
as are now threatened in Indonesia, in Vietnam, and that you hear certain European constituents advocate for an EU-only cloud, how do you work a global company that must meet regulator demands in terms of product approval and, God forbid, product recall, when the data collected in a particular jurisdiction must reside on servers resident in that jurisdiction? As Arturo said, balkanization of data flows. I mean, global companies can't function in that environment, and this is an issue where that affects all industries, and where all industries need to speak up and say, whatever securities concerns you have, whatever concerns you have about the level of proof presented to the FISA court before a warrant is given, whether that should be the same for European nationals, however you want to work that out, work that out. But the solution is not to drop a new iron curtain around your country in respect of data flows.
It's exactly right, and it's made even more complex with new regulations and new requirements that seemingly contradictory around data disclosure and greater data disclosure around clinical trials. And how these regimes come together, I think, is something that will be very important for the industry.
And I would like to add that I wouldn't be able to underscore how significant the private sector to private sector connections are, as both my colleagues on the panel have mentioned. Remember, again, NAFTA, in many ways, yes, the vision of Prime Minister and two presidents driving the negotiations, and the willingness of, two countries more similar but with a very disparate third country, Mexico, deciding to launch into a very ambitious at the time negotiation. So, after 21 years in the Foreign Service, I'm not going to deny the role that governments play in shepherding these processes. But the role of the private sectors, in the case of NAFTA, the role of the private sectors today in what has happened in Latin America with this coalition of the free trade willing that I call, this Pacific axis of countries that all have free trade agreements amongst ourselves, that have free trade agreements with the United States. What has happened with TPP, in many ways, it's the U.S. private sector that has been driving, in many ways, the conversation, the direction, the depth of the engagement, and in many occasions, the governments are following the lead of the private sector. So I think that on a host of issues that we've discussed here, whether it's in the framework of TTIP, whether it's in the framework of TPP, or whether it's in the context of the specific challenges that the industry faces in specific markets throughout the globe, again, the role of the private sector is fundamentally important, and it can really help drive, galvanize, create like-minded coalitions with the private sectors of other countries. So I would encourage you all to continue to do what you did when I was ambassador, which was to come in and see me every month, you know, sometimes bitch and moan, and sometimes congratulate Mexico on the steps that it was taking forward to address some of the concerns of the industry. It is a very important role that you need to continue to play. Again, whether it's the context of very specific challenges that you face with one country or a subset of countries, or whether it's in the framework or the template of these very ambitious free trade agreements that are taking place.
You know, I think that's great advice for us sitting here as a trade association whose mission is engagement and advocacy around the world. So thank you very much for that. We've got just a couple more minutes, right? I'll give you the last question.
Well, I have two questions. One, two participants. First, for Hugo, the U.S. economy and the European economy is really quite similar. They're both at bottom now, ideal economies. In U.S., trade agreements always have a substantial, the bilateral agreements always have a substantial IP chapter. And it's also, you know, it's always an interest to the Congress and others in the administration. The European trade agreements, you're doing now with something like 17 of them, don't typically have IP provisions unless unless the U.S. has already negotiated an FTA, for example, with Korea. Now, why do you think there is such a difference about the prioritization in Brussels around IP in these bilateral agreements? You know, take India, where there was no IP provision at all at the end of the day. Well, the agreement's gone nowhere.
It's not there yet.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's dead now. So the question for you is why do you think there's a difference, since the economies are so similar, since the companies are essentially the same companies on both sides? And then, Dan, perhaps turning to you, you've been involved in a number of negotiations, but also as a practicing attorney, you were involved in some of the issues referred to back years ago in the public health debate, and have also been involved in some trade litigation, which is like the biotech litigation, which was very, very sensitive at the time. What's your sense of the role of not just the negotiation of IP norms, but also the enforcement side?
On the bilateral agreements, this is not exactly true. There are chapters on intellectual property in our agreement with Korea, for instance.
Well, yeah,
There is.
negotiated by the U.S., we negotiated by the EU.
Okay, you gave the good example. Yeah, we accept that. You gave the good example, and we followed. There's one with Canada. True, it's not finished yet, but it's finished. But for one reason or another, we don't come to the very last minute to really sign it. It has been signed, but it isn't approved yet. And there are other bilateral agreements, but it's true that this has not been very prominent. The Europeans were very much in favor of discussing that in the WTO. They had hoped that that WTO would be the good place to discuss this, and probably that's the reason. But you know, recently all the agreements that have been started, the negotiations that have been started, have a chapter on intellectual property. And certainly the negotiators are very much pushed by the constituency, by the stakeholders, to go for an as strong protection system as possible.
Beyond geographic indicators.
No. We are they find geographical indicators very important, but still, there are still other chapters for them also.
Yeah. Dan, you'll get the answer to the last question there, and then I think we'll have to close.
Okay, I will try and be brief. You asked me what the importance of dispute settlement is. It's very important, right? These rules have to mean something, and very often the meaning of these rules needs to be elaborated through dispute settlement. And the parties to dispute settlement are not necessarily the parties who you would predict, right? So we have intellectual property disputes or biotech disputes, not between the United States and an underdeveloped regulatory system, but between the United States and the EU on a regulatory system that has stalled or that has reached a point of stasis and has inserted concerns that do not have a scientific basis. We now see disputes with the government of Canada on the intellectual property front, which I think are useful in demonstrating not only the viability of these rules and the dispute settlement mechanisms, but to other countries that intellectual property is not a tool of neocolonialism, right? That these are rights that exist also between developed countries that can go to dispute settlement. Final word on Canada and NAFTA. Arturo has made a number of comments about the NAFTA negotiations that suggest somehow that Mexico was the poorer cousin and they were looking at the two developed countries. I was a NAFTA negotiator. I've got to tell you, it was the Mexicans who brought Canada and the United States
Into the negotiations.
into the 20th century. They were the ones who showed up with laptops. We didn't have laptops. They were the ones who produced drafts and red lines. They were the ones who were, I would say, as much as the United States, engines for liberalization. And I'll never forget this graphic that came out during the heart of negotiations that we all thought was amusing. Well, two of the three of us thought was amusing. It was an outline of North America. And the outline of Mexico said, manufacturing zone. The outline of the United States said, shopping zone. The outline of Canada said, skiing zone. Anyway, thank you.
We'll have to leave it at that. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Gentlemen, thank you.